Bay Bridge is a disaster. It has been a disaster since the politicians got involved way back in the earthquake.
Oh my God, he says one of the bridges, they didn't say which one's collapsed.
Gosh!
This is a project of a lifetime for a lot of people, and it's a project that's going to save people's lives.
We're confronted with what was fundamentally a very simple project in the grand scheme of things that has become one of the great fiascos of the 20th and 21st centuries in California history.
This bridge is like the tar baby. Once you touch it, you're holding on to it forever.
And you've heard a lot today, I think, about public process and how it might go with the skyway option. And if only everyone held hands and sang Kumbaya, that it would go quickly.
It's been 16 years, and neither the Central Freeway nor the Bay Bridge is done. I mean, come on, 16, it only took us 8 to what, go to the moon. You'd think by this time they'd have something, I don't know, an off-ramp maybe, a drive-through coffee kiosk, something.
Here's my prediction. Around the time that the Bay Bridge is nearing completion, the tectonic plates of the East Bay and San Francisco will have shifted and fused together, and we can just walk across.
If you don't laugh, what are you going to do? You're going to cry. So we'll just have to continue to hope that the comedy of errors ceases.
Going down the road, going down the road, feeling bad. Going down the road, feeling bad.
The San Francisco Bay Area has always been on the edge, geographically and geologically. On either side of the bay lies a major fault line, the San Andreas to the west, the Hayward Fault through the eastern hills. Still, people come from all over the world to San Francisco. And the most traveled route to and from the city by the bay is the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. The Bay Bridge is really 2 bridges. It has west and east spans on either side of Yerba Buena Island. This is the longest steel bridge in the world. More than 8 miles long, it is a marvel of engineering. But it is also a bridge across time, a bridge to the future, a future that remains in suspense.
It's a national monument to engineering and to mobility. This is the second busiest bridge in the country. 282,000 vehicles cross it every day, so it's an extraordinarily significant structure, not just for the mobility of people getting to work, but also the economy. And when you consider that it was built more than 60 years ago with slide rules and no seismic measurements, it's also a testament to engineering.
Well, the first guy to propose a bridge between San Francisco and Oakland was Emperor Norton, who was quite mad, which turns out to be a contagious condition that has affected everybody connected to the bridge since.
Norton I, the self-declared Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico, decreed in 1872 that a suspension bridge be built between San Francisco and Oakland. The project began 60 years later, the first delay in the history of the bridge.
The original bridge, they started the design in about 1932. They started bidding the projects in 1933, and the entire project was done. The entire bridge was built by 36, incredibly quickly. But there was really one man in charge, H.C. Purcell, and he had all the responsibility, but he also had all the authority and the resources he needed to get the job done.
When the Bay Bridge was originally constructed, it consumed 7% of America's steel output. That is a massive amount of raw material. That is enough steel to go from San Francisco to Oakland.
The designers believed, or they claimed, that that bridge would be there for 1,000 years and would ride out any earthquake.
Downtown San Francisco in the background, and we zoom into Candlestick Park. For the first time in 27 years, a World Series game will be played. The Battle of the Bay continues. The Oakland Athletics against the San Francisco Giants.
Hey, you know what? We're having an earthquake.
Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? There go the lights.
The radio out here, he said, oh my God, he says one of the bridges, they didn't say which one's collapsed.
Gosh!
Serious damage on the Bay Bridge. Part of the upper deck east side collapsing on the deck below.
Heading south onto the Nimitz. That is completely collapsed. That's the upper section collapsing into the lower section.
It was very frightening for me when I first learned that a section of the Bay Bridge had collapsed. I couldn't even believe this had happened.
Essentially, one section of the bridge collapsed because the pins I say pins, they're bolts, they're I think 1.5 inches thick, sheared.
What we now know is had that quake, which lasted only 14, 15 seconds, continued for another 15 seconds, we would have had a major catastrophe on the Bay Bridge.
The earthquake of 1989 had an incredible impact on the San Francisco Bay Area. There was a great fear of the collapse of every freeway and a great fear of the collapse of the bridge.
Loma Prieta earthquake taught us and showed us without question that the Bay Bridge, particularly the east spans, is vulnerable to large events. And we have to remember that the Loma Prieta earthquake was some 100 kilometers away from this bridge.
After Loma Prieta shut down the bridge, the Caltrans went into gear, of course, to make repairs, and they made repairs rather quickly, and within 30 days, I believe. And then, of course, began the debate about whether or not to retrofit and repair the bridge or replace it.
The geological evidence is quite strong that there could be a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault and perhaps on part of the San Andreas Fault. We can't predict when a big earthquake will occur in time, but we can say the probability of a magnitude about 7 earthquake or greater is about 2/3, 60% in 30 years.
When the bridge was built, there was no understanding of modern seismology. Dogs still seem better at predicting an earthquake than anything we've come up with. Let's build the city pound at the foot of the Bay Bridge.
I love these scientists who say that animals can predict earthquakes. Oh yeah, I'll be able to tell there's an earthquake coming because my cat is acting aloof.
During the Loma Prieta earthquake, the suspension span to the west remained intact, but it soon became clear that retrofitting the eastern span of the bridge to withstand a big quake was a major challenge.
The foundations on the west crossing are steel and concrete, whereas the ones on the east crossing are hundreds of redwood trees, piles which were driven down into the mud.
The west spans are a suspension bridge, and that by its character and nature is inherently flexible. And that's what we want our structures to be during an earthquake, flexible. We want them to ride out the earthquake rather than fighting it. The east spans is a cantilevered truss structure. Those, unfortunately, are inherently stiff and tend to rip themselves apart during a seismic event. So it was much more difficult to come up with a reasonable retrofit solution for the east spans.
The initial conclusion was a retrofit was the best strategy. My recollection of the first estimate was it was in the ballpark of $200 million when they first really began to engineer it. But as they were doing that work, Northridge hit in 1994.
The overcrossing of the southbound 14, as you see here, has actually collapsed and pancaked onto the northbound lanes of the Golden State Freeway. This is one of 9 bridge structures that have collapsed in the Southland.
Executive orders lifting the red tape and emergency money is producing possibly the fastest freeway building program ever. It's a tribute to both teamwork and technology that a project of this magnitude could be finished not just on time, but well ahead of schedule.
When we were allowed to move forward after the Northridge earthquake, and we were told to get the bridges back in service as quickly as possible, that was the best the department had to offer. We were creative, innovative, resourceful, and did a damn good job.
Everybody worked together as a team. I mean, everybody. I'm talking about the people and the state, and everybody wants it done, working as a team. Totally the opposite of what's happening in the Bay Bridge. You got all the people don't want this, they don't want that, and politicians involved.
Of course, when the Northridge quake went down in '94, boom, they got it done in a year because it's LA and roads are important. But this is San Francisco. Doesn't matter because we just flit from place to place on our magic dream-powered mushrooms.
In the Northern California situation, well, you know, it's a different structure type, a little different sensitivity, and, well, there was a lot more input other than just get the job done.
When the Northridge quake hit in Southern California in 1994, shortly followed in 1995 by the Kobe, Japan earthquake, the seismic engineers at Caltrans began to become more concerned about the impacts of a seismic event on the bridge, which really increased the stakes in terms of the design.
What Northridge did is put fire underneath Caltrans to get it out of the research phase and get it into PS&E, plan, specs, and estimate.
Caltrans retrofitted the east and the west spans of the Bay Bridge. On the west span, orange-clad workers strengthened the foundations, replaced hundreds of thousands of rivets and bolts, and installed cross braces so that this part of the bridge can withstand an earthquake 10 times more powerful than Loma Prieta. The east span received a temporary retrofit, while experts debated whether it could be strengthened enough to survive the next big one.
Ironically, when the debate began about whether to repair or replace the bridge, Caltrans was pretty set on repairing it. And you'd still have an old bridge, and as Caltrans engineer Brian Maroney said, you can put seatbelts on a Model T, but it's still a Model T. It's not going to be as safe as a modern bridge.
In January 1996, Director Van Lobensel's asked the question, given the price of the retrofit on the east spans of the Bay Bridge, what might a new bridge or replacement structure look like and cost?
Brian Maroney's answer was, you know, it may be safer to build a new bridge, and it may cost the same.
The New Bay Bridge has been studied. Committees appointed, panels put together, reports written. Financial experts have looked at this in triplicate. Look, if all the trees that were cut down to write these reports were just thrown into the bay, we could walk across to Oakland.
Why did it take 7 years to decide to replace versus retrofit? I think we were realizing how little we knew about the existing structure, how complicated it was. About the time we got to a reasonably comfortable retrofit strategy and priced it out, the numbers came out such that the department thought, well, wait a minute, we should examine a replacement.
All else being equal, it's probably a better idea to replace the structure.
It looks like we have a deal.
On February 13th, 1997, Governor Pete Wilson announced that the east span of the Bay Bridge would be replaced. The estimated cost, $1.5 billion.
Pete Wilson's announcement was an announcement to declare that we were going to rebuild the bridge and that it would look like a causeway. A causeway is basically a freeway over water. It's been derided by East Bay politicians as a freeway on stilts. They didn't see it as an elegant solution to the problem. Fundamentally, the Skyway's philosophy was, let's keep it clean and simple. Let's have a thin ribbon across the bay. However, it was recognized by many that there might be a desire for something more visually spectacular. Look at the two cities which it connects. It connects San Francisco, this glamorous worldwide icon on one hand, and Oakland, this gritty, blue-collar, military transportation hub on the other. There's always been this envy in the East Bay that the East Bay didn't get its fair share.
A lot of this has to do with the East Bay inferiority complex. I mean, they're looking at the Golden Gate Bridge, it's gorgeous. Look at our bridge, it's drab. We can be pretty too.
Oakland Mayor Jerry Brown wanted there to be world attention brought to the city of Oakland on the design of this bridge.
I wanted a great, aesthetically impressive bridge.
The East Bay politicians particularly rebelled against the design. They put a measure on an advisory vote on the ballot. Overwhelmingly, voters in East Bay communities voted against the so-called freeway on stilts.
The governor said, fine, Bay Area, you want a fancy bridge, you pick the design, you pick the alignment, you can pay for part of it. And they had a funding deal that they subsequently came up with. But At the time, Pete Wilson just wanted a new bridge.
Director Van Lobensel's presented the Skyway saying this is Caltrans' recommendation. However, if the Bay Area chooses, they can have something else. One high-end alternative was a 2-tower cable stay.
When Governor Pete Wilson made the announcement that there would be a new bridge and not a retrofitted bridge, he knew that if he couldn't get the Bay Area on board and in the tent, so to speak, that he was going to be in big trouble.
Governor Wilson and the state legislature gave the job of selecting the new bridge to an agency run by politicians from the 9 Bay Area counties, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC. Wilson, who demanded the Bay Area pay part of the cost of any bridge better looking than a skyway, allowed local officials to determine what it looked like. Former Governor Jerry Brown did not think this was a good idea.
Well, how many engineers does the MTC have? Caltrans, I mean, heck, I laid off 1,000 engineers when I was governor. They must have 10,000 more. Those people know what they're professionals. They build stuff. They know how to do that. That's under the governor. If they want to take some planning agency with, 20 or 30 local politicians that don't know a bridge from a freeway and turn the problem over to them, I'd say that's a formula for disaster.
I remember Mary King once telling me, Brian, it's okay, settle down a bit. This is the public process. This is the democratic process. And we need to take the time and go to 100 meetings if we need to and listen to everyone and consider every idea.
The democracy in action was the best part about it to me, to give the public an opportunity to comment in what turned out to be probably the longest public hearing in history on what would be likely the largest public project any of us would ever see in our lifetimes, in a very, very visible location.
Unfortunately, the process devolved into the series of task force hearings in which pretty much every special interest in the Bay Area showed up to have their say about what they wanted. Transit man in leotards on a unicycle shows up wanting the bridge dedicated to mass transit.
MTC set up a panel it called EDAP, the Engineering and Design Advisory Panel. EDAP would process design proposals. Members of the public would present their ideas for a new east span to BBDTF, the Bay Bridge Design Task Force. The Caltrans Seismic Advisory Board, the CSAB, would review their choice. The MTC expected EDAP, BBDTF, and CSAB to approve the BB, ASAP.
This panel of experts began meeting, and it was an enormous, very laborious process. And trying to get anybody to agree, let alone dozens of engineers and architects to agree, good luck.
The public process was supposed to last maybe 6 months. It probably went about 18. It became acrimonious, but it was a unanimous vote on the design of the bridge, with one exception, that being of Mayor Harris of Oakland, who just didn't like the design.
There really has not been a futuristic view of this. There's no vision, as far as I'm concerned.
At that time, as I recall, he said the bridge was but ugly.
Alameda County Supervisor Mary King grew more and more frustrated throughout the process with the delays and the struggle to try to come up with a design. And she really felt strongly, and to this day feels strongly, that the entire public safety aspect of this process was completely abandoned for what became a political circus, or as she called it, a Three Stooges movie.
There began to be issues raised that I think had little to do with the facts that were on the table. And at that point, people seemed to start bumping into each other and poking each other in the eyes. That's when it seemed like a Three Stooges movie to me.
To call this whole thing a three-ring circus is to seriously disrespect professional clowns.
You do wonder, at what point does the open and democratic public process need to be curbed or managed better, in a sense, if you've got a serious public safety project? But as we know in the Bay Area, we care about our bridges. We go nuts when they want to, do something to the Golden Gate Bridge or the Western Span. Our bridges are part of the symbology of the Bay Area, part of our landscape, and people are very attached to it. So when you start screwing around with that, people get upset.
The public put many demands on the new bridge and contributed many designs. An archway drawn with a pie tin, a roller coaster, a teepee tower, and a double-breasted two-tower structure. Bicycle advocates persuaded MTC to include a bike path. The Bay Bridge Design Task Force selected the bridge proposed by a joint venture of T.Y. Lin International and Moffett and Nickel engineers. The architect, Donald MacDonald, had designed a self-anchored suspension bridge, or SAS, that actually holds itself up.
We must have done 10 or 12 designs. We really studied all the variations, 2 towers, 3 towers, 1 tower, trying to get the best solution. But the process was messy in the sense that we must have had 30-plus meetings with the public, and it was open. In fact, I think it was one of the first times Caltrans really opened it up. In a way, it was a great thing to have because they understood the reasons for this complexity and the magnitude of the problems that had to be solved.
This single tower design would cover only a sixth of the total east span. The rest would be skyway.
When the design for the Bay Bridge was selected, the self-anchored suspension span, considerable controversy swirled about the selection of that design. Some elected officials felt the process was crooked and felt there had been an inside job.
It was brought to our attention that some of the members of our panel had some connection, financial or otherwise, with some of the firms that were presenting designs. We took 2 steps, Senator, to try to safeguard against a conflict of interest influencing the outcome. The first one was disclosure. And at that workshop, we asked members of our panel, if you have any such connection, disclose it. They raised their hands and identified it.
How many hands were raised in this little poll?
As I recall it, it was about, it may have been as many as a third of the members.
You're telling me that a third of the EDAP members had a financial interest in these discussions? Our conflict of interest laws don't require disclosure, they require disqualification. If you've got a financial interest in a decision that you're making, you should not be involved in that decision, period.
There was no direct connection between our process, between the firms that submitted design and who was awarded the work.
Once the design was selected and that painful process had, come to some sort of conclusion, the next phase of delay started with the Navy and San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown. The Navy owned Treasure Island, and the city was angling to take control of that property. And the new alignment for the bridge as proposed on the northern side was where the mayor had plans for a brew pub and restaurants and a convention center. And he became convinced that, he needed to change that alignment. He really felt strongly that he could just move the bridge. What was the problem?
One of the big problems is mixing engineers with politicians. Engineers are used to dealing with logic and math and facts. Totally unfamiliar territory for politicians.
At the time of the announcement and that the northern alignment was the alignment of choice by the Wilson administration, it became very clear to San Francisco that we were receiving title to a piece of property that had some severe limitations on any potential economic development.
The northern alignment of the Bay Bridge would have required footings on Yerba Buena Island, which would have been right smack in the middle of the boutique mall that was part of San Francisco's redevelopment plan. The policy of the government was to support the local redevelopment authority. We said, we support the San Francisco plan. Can't you figure out some other way to put the footings in?
Anchoring the east span to the southern side of Yerba Buena would not have affected the city's plans for the island or for the adjacent Treasure Island. But Caltrans opposed a southern alignment, which would interfere with operations of the U.S. Coast Guard station there.
The city and the Navy formulated a partnership, somewhat of an unholy alliance. I mean, how does any city get the United States Navy to take their position against an entire region when a consensus had been reached?
The Navy in San Francisco became allies instantly. It became as if we were one voice at each stage, and that was good for the city. And there's nothing that creates a better working relationship than allies who have a common enemy. And in this case, Caltrans was the common enemy.
The mayor pushed really hard for that alignment to change. His number one delaying tactic was to keep the Navy from ever agreeing to give Caltrans access to the property. And the Navy went along with this for a number of years.
It became a bit frustrating when we felt that the whole community had selected this and gave us our orders of go forward, when all of a sudden we were not allowed to collect the geotechnical information on Yerba Buena Island. It effectively put an iron curtain up, essentially destroying the schedule. It was devastating.
We frequently would go out to the island to look at the existing structure, look at preliminary work, but we were told by the city of San Francisco if we went out there that we would be thrown in jail.
Mayor Willie Brown appointed Anne Marie Conroy, a former county supervisor, to head San Francisco's Treasure Island Development Authority. Conroy threatened to sue the state over the northern alignment and tried to woo Mary King.
Anne Marie Conroy was somebody that I'll always remember. She took me out on the island to, I suppose, lobby me about the Bay Bridge, whether it be a northern alignment or a southern alignment. And she served me the most stale bologna sandwich. It was really very dry with really horribly hard crust. And I thought, my goodness, if she's trying to convince me to be for her position, she needs lessons. But this was to explain to us that the shadow on Admiral Nimitz' house was somehow going to be such a tragedy that we should change the alignment of the bridge.
Is this something out of Lord of the Rings? A shadow must never cross the home of the Admiral. First of all, he's been dead for 40 years. Second of all, he had a ship, an entire fleet, in fact. He didn't need a house.
I've stood at the Nimitz house. You look up and there's a bridge. There's going to be a bridge, I think 40, 50 feet closer. Certainly it's going to be a little bit more imposing, but it wasn't as though you were putting a bridge where there had been no bridge. This is a house that's almost under a major bridge, and it's going to sit a little more under a major bridge. Ironically, Nimitz rarely lived in the house. His wife hated the place and spent most of their time in Berkeley.
The Navy and the city were able to delay the progress of what I considered to be a public safety project. How in the world could the Navy, who is set up to protect and defend, obstruct the protection and defense of the hundreds and thousands of people that were going across a seismically unsafe span?
Well, the Navy felt caught in the middle between the city's desire to redevelop the property and pursue a plan that they had worked out, and Caltrans' desire to put the footings down in a location that was incompatible with that plan.
And it felt as though the United States Navy was in a war game with the people of the Bay Area region who had gone through a public and fair process.
During this brouhaha, Gray Davis became California's governor. With a Democrat in the State House as well as the White House, many expected a breakthrough on the bridge.
Davis wanted this thing built, and Davis's appointments on the California Transportation Commission were beginning to voice his frustration in 2000. And so in May of that year, they brought in the Navy to testify, why are you holding up this bridge? And it was a very politically dramatic moment. And they basically said, if this thing falls down before we're finished, the blood will be on the Navy's hands.
Another factor in the bridge delays was the safety issue raised by a UC Berkeley professor of engineering, Abul Hassan Astani. After his bridge design was rejected, he became a fierce critic of the winning self-anchored suspension bridge.
I expressed great concerns about seismic safety of this bridge. There are no bridges like this built in the world.
Professor Astani had done some computer modeling showing that the SAS tower was critically vulnerable. He took that model to Willie Brown. Willie Brown showed it to Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein and Willie Brown both invited him to the White House. The Army Corps of Engineers did another study about whether the thing is safe.
And because he's a professor and he works in the seismic zones, people had to do analysis all over again.
Research and policy for the building of the Bay Bridge since 1989 has largely involved countless panels, review boards, consultants, a detailed study by the Army Corps of Engineers, and I think what we need to do is bronze these guys along with the meddling politicians, and they could be bolted to the bridge in a symbolic position of holding it up, much the way that their input has stalled progress over the years.
Willie Brown's chief activity was to use his connections at the White House to try to keep the Navy from going along with Caltrans' plan. In the end, it was all for naught, and a very smart lawyer at the Federal Highways Administration, Karen Skelton, found this little-known provision in federal law.
The nature of the dilemma at Yerba Buena was that it was a three-headed beast, and all three heads could not agree on how to move forward, and there became a food fight in the federal government between the Navy and the Department of Transportation.
So somebody had to step forward and resolve that dispute, and the only persons that had the prestige to be able to do that was, in fact, the White House.
Willie Brown lobbied President Clinton to support his position on the bridge. But Governor Davis had White House connections too, and he wanted a northern alignment.
Gray Davis did make a difference. He deserves some credit for breaking that logjam. Nobody knew how to get out of the mess. And so it took the intervention of the White House to see through the woods.
The White House acts as a paternal organization, and when they have two agencies fighting with each other, at some point when the dishes start to smash at the kitchen table, they need to take interest. 6 or so months we met as a team at the White House to try to figure out if there were a way that Caltrans could operate under federal law because it was a federal highway. And we did have a eureka moment.
In the end, the Federal Highways Administration was able to find statutes that allowed them to take possession of the land, to take precedence over the city of San Francisco. And once they did that, we were finally able to get onto the island and do the geotechnical exploration.
And I think the fundamental point here was that people rightfully were driven and motivated and inspired by the fact that people could die at any time if the bridge were to collapse during a seismic episode.
2 years behind schedule, groundbreaking for the skyway was greeted with great enthusiasm. By this time, the cost estimate for the east span was $2.6 billion.
This was a collaborative effort to make this day possible, but it has arrived. God has smiled, recognizing this is a wonderful day. Let's build this bridge.
When Gray Davis announced, let's build this thing, it was like this collective sigh. It was a sense from all the MTC people and all the politicians who had worked on it of finally the monkey's off our back. Finally we can get on with building this thing.
This project obviously comes with a lot of challenges. It's a first of a kind. It's a special bridge. It's a segmental bridge which is new to California. The new bridge can move not inches but several feet. And components are built into the bridge to allow that movement to occur without any collapse or damage to the bridge. There's a lot of pride in working on something this special, this big, and something that is going to be part of history.
When Gray Davis announced that the bridge was going to be built in 5 years, most of us in the Transportation Press Corps, we just laughed, because this bridge had never gone on schedule. It had so many difficulties, but Gray Davis wanted that bridge to be built and wanted to be able to say that that bridge was built under his watch. And of course, his watch didn't last as long as he thought it was going to. After Gray Davis was recalled and the new governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, came on the scene, he seemed to not really know there was a bridge being built. He seemed to not really know there was a Caltrans. And I don't think that anyone in his administration, the issue with the Bay Bridge really registered. It wasn't until that fateful bid opening day for the self-anchored suspension span, when there was only one bid opener and the bid was substantially over budget, that things began to fly.
When the bids opened, there was audible gasping in Caltrans headquarters in Sacramento. And it came in at $1.4 billion. The estimate was $730 million.
On May 26th of 2004, the bid did come in, and it was substantially, almost double, over the engineer's estimate at the time. Until those bids were open, we did not have the certainty that we would, in fact, be going over the budget that was approved by the legislature back in 2001. Clearly, we knew at that point that we did not have sufficient resources to complete the bridge.
Governor Schwarzenegger appointed Will Kempton to be director of Caltrans in November of 2004. Kempton took the helm at a time when the state's budget was submerged in a sea of red ink. The skyway portion of the bridge was under construction, but no one knew what the final segment, the self-anchored suspension span, would cost, or when it could be completed. Oh. Yeah.
The construction industry was responding to the changing world and realizing they couldn't afford to do this project. They couldn't afford to take the chance on this project. If it goes wrong for them, they could lose their whole company. So who's going to gamble on that?
There's a deleted scene in the Spielberg adaptation of War of the Worlds, and as the invading ships are pulverizing landmarks from around the globe, they wipe out the Eiffel Tower and they vaporize the Great Wall of China. As they get to the Bay Area, they're hovering over the Bay Bridge, about to destroy it, and they hold their fire and they say, why bother? It's in enough trouble.
Caltrans faced a lot of big decisions. Where do we get the money? Do we stick with this design? Is there some other way we can save money?
The costs of the Bay Bridge have gone up astronomically. Again, it's hard to fathom how Caltrans could be so far off in the estimates. 1.5 went to $2.5 billion in 3 years' time, and then it nearly doubled again. So we've had huge miscalculations.
The Schwarzenegger administration did not announce the full cost until mid-August of 2004, when they told the world they needed $6.2 billion.
The reason that we experienced cost increases on this project are primarily twofold. First of all, the bidding environment post 9/11 has materially changed the cost of doing construction, particularly for mega projects. It's driven up the cost of insurance, it's driven up the cost of bonding.
The cost of the new Eastern Span started out around $1 billion and is now over $6 billion. The contributing factors range from just the delay associated with the new bridge design, the funding fights at the legislature, of which there were several. This is the largest self-anchored suspension span of this type attempted to be built in the world. There's a considerable amount of engineering uncertainty associated with that.
A lot of events have occurred that were way outside of our control and things that we couldn't have predicted. And yet, some seem to think we should have had a crystal ball to see that there would be terrorist attacks, or to see that the Chinese would be buying up every piece of steel in the U.S. We never could have seen that coming. Nobody ever did. And in this case, time is our enemy. We thought we'd be done with the design in 18 months and it would be built in 3 years.
Going down the road, feeling bad. Going down the road, feeling bad. Going down the road, feeling bad. Yeah, yeah. Don't wanna be treated this way.
After all these years since Loma Prieta, the public, continues to drive on the old bridge, which every seismic engineer that we've ever talked to says is a hazard.
We've really been very fortunate that this great earthquake has not occurred during the period of delay in this bridge. The failure of the East Bay crossing, carrying perhaps the greatest economic stream of any bridge in the country, would be just such as to alter the whole economic basis in the Bay Area, and everyone would be affected. There are issues here which are well beyond seismology and engineering, which go into political questions which no one would have imagined would have arisen.
In December of 2004, more than 15 years after Loma Prieta, Sonny McPeak, who headed the governor's Business, Transportation and Housing Agency, made an announcement that shook the Bay Area. Schwarzenegger was dropping the self-anchored suspension span.
Based on all of the information we've had, all of the review by experts, all of the independent analysis by the team convened by the Federal Highway Administration, Governor Schwarzenegger and I are proposing that we complete the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge with the skyway design for that main span. It can be completed for, we estimate, at least 300 to 400 million less.
I was surprised that Governor Schwarzenegger decided to weigh in on this issue because it had such a life of its own and not a very good life.
And Schwarzenegger doesn't like the SAS design, so he stops it mid-construction. I guess it's too much of a girly bridge. Yes, he wants a manly bridge.
The governor wants to change it and do it the way I suggest it should be done with the VITA. Let's save the money. Let's have a safer bridge. Let's go. And I went and also told them that if they wanted to look like the signature bridge, then put a phony tower up in the air and run some cables down, right? You can do that for 10, 15 million, right? And it'll look like a signature bridge, right? So the public driving by, they ain't gonna know the difference anyhow.
It's the process that concerns me the most at this moment, because it's the process that somehow led to this monumental fiasco that we're now addressing.
Believe me, there was no percentage in us withholding from you the fact that there were cost increases on this project due to the last administration.
The hearings that the Senate convened were basically twofold. One was, how did you reach this conclusion to build the Skyway? Two, how do you answer what the state auditor is saying about Caltrans' management of the whole program? They grilled Sonny McPeak and Will Kempton for the better part of 3 days.
There was no clear consensus on the correct path to seismic safety. In many cases, we are talking about judgment issues here.
This is a state highway project. We should not have the MTC calling the shots. This is a matter of statewide significance. It is a part of the state highway system. It is not a plaything for regional or local governments to involve themselves in.
How about this for an idea? Survivor, Treasure Island. We take all the politicians and all the contractors and we put them on Treasure Island, and the only way they can win is to build a bridge from the island to Oakland.
Well, the blame game on this project started from the first day. The first people to get blamed was Caltrans. People love to pick on Caltrans. It's a big organization, it's a big orange organization. How come it took you so long to decide to replace rather than repair? Why did the deliberation over seismic work take so long?
I think it's unfortunate that many people have tried to use the department as a scapegoat for the cost increases and schedule delays associated with this bridge project.
I think there is a reason to suppose that Caltrans sometimes did not move as quickly as they might. They had other bridges that had to be retrofitted, but the main problems lie outside Caltrans' control.
Politicians being involved definitely has a big bearing on the dollars, a huge bearing on the dollars. The state didn't design this job. They hired outside designers for this job, and I think that was a terrible mistake.
Then we shifted into blaming Willie Brown because of his opposition to the alignment and the other mayors who wanted to design. Then we blamed the legislature and the lawmakers for not being able to come up with the right fundraising to be able to pay for the bridge. And then we come down to blaming Osama bin Laden.
Well, it's been one of the more frustrating things that I've encountered in all my years as an elected official. I've worked on countless public works projects. I've never seen anything like this go so far off base, so far off original estimates, and get so embroiled in politics.
Several years ago when I began, reporting on this, I could have never imagined that the price tag would be over $6 billion. The cost of the state and the Bay Area's inability to come to an agreement on this bridge has been horrific. We have racked up escalation costs of $400,000 a day. At least $140 million has been attributed simply to the delay during this bickering.
I don't think you can make light of this horror and this incredible delay and this incredible increase in costs.
The rising costs that shocked even Mayor Willie Brown were due to years of delay and the global increase in demand for steel and concrete. The East Span needed 200 million pounds of steel and 500,000 cubic yards of concrete. The tab for the bike lane was $225 million. And then there were the environmental protections, like the bubble curtain Caltrans built around the piers to protect the fish.
There was a sensitivity to how we could protect the environment. When you pound piles, there's a great transfer of energy from the hammer to the pile and then from the pile to the water. And that energy wave can kill fish. It's like if you threw a stick of dynamite into a pond, the fish are either killed or stunned. And what we do is we surround that pile while it's being driven with bubbles, just blowing massive amounts of air around it. And that attenuates or softens that shock wave and protects fish.
The latest saga to strike the Bay Bridge construction came up a little bit earlier this year, in which a group of welders on the skyway portion of the bridge alleged that their employer had forced them to work too quickly and to gloss over bad welds in order to get the project ahead of schedule. And this, of course, caused construction to come to an immediate halt, caused considerable delays. The FBI became involved.
Hey, Randy, this is Sean, just checking in, see if you heard anything new about the bridge. When we learned of the FBI's investigation, we felt it would be derelict not to report the story. It took us 9 months. We didn't get into this lightly. We wanted to get multiple sources. We wanted to get documents.
We immediately halted concrete pouring on the project after these allegations were surfaced, knowing it was going to be an expensive process, but nonetheless we felt we had an obligation to demonstrate to the public that a safe bridge is being constructed. And I'm happy to report that the Federal Highway Administration clearly demonstrated that our practices meet or exceed industry standards. And so we feel that we've been vindicated with respect to those allegations. I'm very proud of the effort of our folks working on this bridge. Their dedication and their commitment to the project is truly very impressive.
Construction resumed on the Skyway, but the Republican governor and the Democratic legislature remained deadlocked on how to complete the bridge. Finally, Schwarzenegger agreed to accept the signature span.
After 7 months gridlock, Governor Schwarzenegger and his crew conceded on the design, said, okay, Bay Area, you can have your self-anchored suspension, but the state capped its contribution on the overruns to $630 million. And in return for that concession, the Bay Area would assume joint custody or joint management control over the construction of the rest of the bridge. Once Senator Don Perrotta talked with Arnold Schwarzenegger, they had a discussion, and in a matter of a few hours, the deal was done.
In the compromise deal, bridge tolls will rise to $4, a year earlier than planned. And the state will pay less than 20% of the remaining costs of the new bridge.
We now have a plan that will give us a safe bridge, a modern bridge that preserves the original design, and a bridge that can be built as quickly and as affordably as possible. So all this makes me a very happy governor today.
I'm very confident that we have made the right decision, that the skyway that the governor's office wanted to pursue would not have been acceptable to the Bay Area, and in fact may not have been built on time because all their environmental work would have to be redone. It took 5 years to get the environmental work done here.
What we needed first and foremost was a decision so that we could begin to build a bridge and get seismic safety in that small gap as quickly as possible. I think we're all relieved. If I could characterize the department's response, we're happy to have a decision.
Under the new legislation, really an unprecedented element was added. The Bay Area Toll Authority would assume project management control with Caltrans and the California Transportation Commission over the construction of the rest of this bridge. We'll be able to go into meetings now and see decisions being made on this bridge at a level the public had not had access to in the past. There won't be any finger-pointing anymore between the Bay Area Toll Authority and Caltrans because they're all in the same boat. They sink themselves, they're all going down together.
One of the reasons that the additional oversight was incorporated in the legislation was concerns about the management of this particular project over the past couple of years. I welcome additional oversight, additional management capabilities. I think that will be very, very helpful as we move through this process.
Previously, we went through 18 months of a bid period that was like a merry-go-round gone wild. And until really the rubber hits the road and the bids hit the street, we're not going to be completely comfortable.
The biggest fear in all of this is that once again, we'll only have one bidder. Much of the conditions that created that climate last year still exist. The heavy demand on the steel market, the cost and availability of supplies.
In going back to the SAS, I think we all have cautious optimism. We created a vision of a world-class, beautiful structure, and it's highly technologically advanced. It's one of a kind. Nobody's built anything like this before, so I don't think any of us can fully envision the problems that may come up until they're out there fabricating the pieces and fitting them together. That's when we'll really find out where the bodies are buried. I probably shouldn't say it that way, should I?
Well, I think the moral of it is to keep as much of the politics out of it as possible, and to remember there's a lot of big money rolling around. And when you get into these huge projects, the profits are incredible. It's like a gravy train.
I think the story of the Bay Bridge will be about the interconnection between politics and engineering, and how you can take a perfectly simple engineering concept and let politicians get a hold of it and drag it out for 15 plus years and drive the costs up sixfold.
It's very likely that in the end, the saga of the Bay Bridge will grow in size and endure maybe as a legend, maybe as a parable. And I picture an old man telling the story to his grandchild, and then the kid asks at the end, like, "Grandpa, what happens? Did they build a bridge?" And then the grandfather has to break it to him and say, well, you know, maybe in your lifetime.
When you're pregnant for 9 months and uncomfortable, it seems really, really long. When you have a successful birth, you forget the pain. Hopefully, this bridge will one day be a successful birth.
All the controversy will be forgotten, and people will really appreciate the monument, the symbol of the Bay Area, the symbol of California.
If we could build a beautiful bridge like the Golden Gate in the Depression, then today we should be able to build also a beautiful bridge for the Bay.
All I know is that the minute the bridge is open, almost everybody will forgive and forget whatever delayed its opening.
It may well turn out to be a pretty good play on Broadway someday, you know. We get to see who would play Willie Brown, and who would play Mary King, and who would play, of course, Governor Schwarzenegger could play himself.